Sina from the University of Amsterdam, Arsenio Cuenca from the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, John Schrobach from our own institute here, and Dusan Bozalka from University Paris Panthéon Assas, who hopefully will be joining us soon. He was totally sick yesterday, so I hope you will be fine this morning. So as usual, 15 minutes for each of our speaker, 1 hour, and then we will have half an hour discussion, then a coffee break. And in the second part of the morning, we'll be moving to looking at the US. So I will begin by giving the floor to Gulnaz for a presentation on challenging international liberal order, authoritarian state, and the geopolitics of religious soft power.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be back in DC. Today, indeed, I would present some of the work in progress. So this is a little bit of a new direction for me that I'm going through.
Louder, please. Yeah, we don't hear.
You guys cannot hear? Is it on? It's on. Oh, it's on. Okay, I should probably, lean a bit more. So it's a new direction in my research. Therefore, I would really, really appreciate any feedback, any suggestions that you guys might have. Just to position myself a little bit, already yesterday we have been talking a lot about indeed the attraction and transnational links between different players whom we do label as illiberal, but specifically also because of my background, I have been working on the religious aspect and how religion, religious institutions, religious symbolism also plays a role in fostering or facilitating some of the connections. And in this regard, I think indeed you may be familiar with Clifford Bobb's work that already appeared more than 10 years ago. So in this case, this is something that have been going on already at least for a decade. And there, Clifford Bob already for the first time also showed how different religious grassroots initiatives do work together on some of the international platforms like United Nations in either promoting certain legislation or blocking certain decisions. There's the phenomenon that he called Baptist Burqa networks. And now he also says that it's Baptist Burqa and Babushka, which again, you may agree or disagree, but basically emphasizing the role of Russia in this religious networking. And indeed, what I'm looking at specifically is that the grassroots work of different players has been visible, it has been studied. But what is interesting is that increasingly it looks like the illiberal players on the state level are also entering the game. So it's not only, for instance, different organizations that speak against about abortion or LGBTQ rights, but also that states, through their funding, also participating in funding some of these initiatives. And in this regard, this is indeed a bit more recent research that appears over the last years. Indeed, it's Peter Mandeville's concept of the geopolitics of religious soft power, where he looks indeed at some of bigger players, be it China, be it Turkey, how they use their religious symbolism. So whether it's their religious identity, for instance, with Turkey being the Islamic country and playing the role of the former caliphate, or China, which at the surface looks like a religious or more like atheist state, but still very much plays in Buddhist networks in through the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, or Christian evangelical networks. But trying to position this a little bit in the theoretical framework is, of course, there is globalization plays a role, also through some of the social media networks, and of course the whole concept of desecularization. So how we, as the world, also going into the state where more and more it seems religious rituals, religious symbolism reappears, and how some of the indeed bigger players, like on the state level, are trying to use that to build certain soft power mechanisms. What I'm looking at is specifically the global south. I totally understand the problematic use of the notion, but here it's mostly about indeed the experience of colonialism and some of the critique of colonialism from that perspective, and how colonialism becomes intertwined with liberalism. So in this case, indeed, how colonial and illiberal come together. And why religion serves as an interesting framework, just also like a little bit of an empty signifier where you could put many of the topics that we have been discussing yesterday, where it just helps to sort of bring them together and create more or less a coherent ideology. And I will just quickly elaborate on some of them. Because one of the things is indeed this positioning of critique against the secularism in a sense that religion, religious institutions, and religious values are considered to be legit as the ones constructing and building networks within the society. So this is more of, again, sort of critique of liberalism through secularism in a sense that, you know, some of the countries and some of the regions do say religious identity matters and we want to keep it. And this is also our sort of right to build our societies based on what they see as religious values. And of course, another aspect is the critique of more what we will call cultural liberalism. And in this, it's more about the rights of individuals. And probably you will guess that the most contented and contested area is LGBTQ rights, gay rights. And with the Global South, of course, this is also one of the issues that has been raised very actively. And the third one is more, you would say, academic, but it's also very much percolates into the broader society where the emphasis is that it's not the West who should explain who we are and how we think and what kind of, you know, processes we go through, but that there should be space also for our own forms of knowledge production, not necessarily based on rationalism. So there's importance of faith, importance of, you know, visions, also religious type of knowledge. And what is interesting is that indeed all these three aspects, in case of, for instance, Russia, this very much has been built into the tradition of thinking. So there is a whole tradition of this critique, both through the imperial period to a certain degree also Soviet period, and of course the post-Soviet period. And what you see is that at the moment it seems like there is an overlap. So on the one hand, you have already the tradition of that sort of critique in the global south, and then some of the actors like Russia come with their own critique, where on the surface it seems that the topics are overlapping. And what I'm hoping to see is whether there is also ideological actually link. So whether it's only pragmatism that, for instance, some of the African countries do like to work with Russia, or there is also something on the ideological level where some of the concerns are shared. And just to be maybe a little bit specific, what I'm also looking at how the image of Russia and first of all the Soviet Union as this anti-imperialist, so to some degree decolonial power is being revived, and Russia of course builds on it. But then instead of with class solidarity, so more economic critique of liberalism, it now moves to the identity solidarity. So it's more cultural solidarity based on certain identities that Russia claims to promote. Just give examples. So with the critique of secularizations, of course, Russia as the protector of believers, of Christian believers, and this is also that Russian Orthodox Church has been very much playing into. With the cultural liberalism critique, it's of course Russia as a protector of traditional values. So it's again some of the tropes that Russia plays into. And with the indeed the critique of West-centered knowledge, it's also Russia's sort of independence and attempt to rebuild its own educational system that is separate from the Western institutions. What is interesting in this case is that Russia, unlike Turkey or China, has the potential to attract both Christian and Muslim communities. So this is really a asset. And although you would say indeed Muslims are a smaller community, so how Russia does position itself as a Muslim country, I would try to show that this is possible. And here just a few examples, just to give you some case studies that sort of try and bring some of these theoretical frameworks into practice. So just this September, Wall Street Journal published an investigation showing that indeed Russia and US religious conservative, mostly evangelical Christians cooperated together in pushing through Uganda's anti-homosexuality law. There has been rumors going, but I think this investigation actually proves it. So this is also to show that some of the Russia's Christian oligarchs, Malafeyev and his network of NGOs and some, you know, individuals, but of course with the pretty much approval of the state, is cooperating with the US evangelicals in Africa. At the same time, below you will see that the Russian Orthodox Church created Russian Orthodox African Exarchate, so also trying reinstate its presence in Africa and talking to some of the Orthodox Christian communities, but also very much engaging in proselytism, where interestingly So Russia offers opportunities to study for African students in theological and Christian universities in Russia. So some of the Soviet infrastructure about allowing African students to travel to Russia to study, now it's not so much into the engineering as it was in the past century, but more, becoming a priest and, receiving some education in traditional values. With Islam, I would totally understand your skepticism maybe, but it's increasingly also changing. Since 2022, we do see some of the new initiatives like Russia Islamic World Forum, which took place also in Kazan, the same city where the BRICS is taking place. And again, this is also again symbolic importance that BRICS is taking place in a Muslim majority republic. And although it is indeed less institutionally big as with the Orthodox Christianity, Russia is very much indeed using also the muftiates and religious institution to at least position itself as a player in economic field. So where the halal aspect, halal tourism, halal industry is sort of a package through which some of the economic transactions that have been playing anyways are now also being repackaged. And again, of course, this is in opposition to the trade, for instance, with the West. Just to conclude, on the one hand, yeah, when we talk about the soft power, we also quite often think about the cultural language promotion. So this still is there. So the Ruski Mir and how it was presented. So Ruski Mir is still very active in the global south, but then it becomes intertwined with the religious institutions. So language and education is very much connected to religious systems. What is indeed interesting, and this is very much indeed needs to be tested empirically, is the nostalgia for the USSR as this, counterbalance. But on the one hand, of course, there is this whole ideological layer to it as the anti-imperialist state and anti-decolonial posturing. But the question is to what extent it's really ideology-based and to what extent it's pragmatism. So, and again, maybe both can coexist, but at different levels of the society. So this is also one of the things that I would love to do, but still looking for money to do that, is indeed to see how people, for instance, in countries like Uganda, actually perceiving all this ideological work that Russian-linked actors are doing, and to what extent it's really sort of, as we were talking yesterday, translation of the work and reading them and trying to sort of understand, or is it just simply very pragmatic finance and some of the, economic benefiting? But that, again, sort of needs really, really empiric work, so needs to still to be done. And on the last point, is that, of course, with the Global South, religious soft power doesn't exist on its own. And again, with Africa, you will totally be aware that also overlaps with some of the other forms of power play, both in terms of information infrastructure. It's of course that, some of the Russia-based channels are operating there, but also hard power. So with the Wagner, the Wagner situation has changed a lot over the last half a year, but still, it's present. And from what we do read, they also interact. So the patriarchate that has been established, it has direct connection also to Wagner, so both personal, but also in terms of how they operate. On that, thanks.
Thank you so much, Gunas, for this fascinating presentation. In fact, continuing really on very close topics will be Arsenio discussing illiberal postcolonialism, the multipolarity forum, which has been happening in Russia. So we stay in this kind of decolonial illiberalism. John is playing double role today, as you noticed, both as staff and as scholar presenting.
Morning, everybody. Me.
You need to speak really closely.
Thank you very much for attending here today. Thank you very much to the organizers, John and Marlene, for putting up this conference full of colleagues and good ideas around illiberalism as an ideology and a methodology of research. My presentation is going to delve into a concept I've been working through the lenses of illiberalism recently, which is illiberal postcolonialism. And my empirical case of study will be the multipolarity forum to analyze and understand better what's exactly what we're talking about here. So the forum, the multipolarity forum, is a congress organized in Russia in 2024 that has been already preceded by similar initiatives, although online, in 2023, the Global Conference on Multipolarity and the European Conference on Multipolarity. And multipolarity has been also presented through Dugin, Alexander Dugin, at the 2024 St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, which is counts on the presence of President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, and its level of importance, let's say, is even bigger. And what I've seen these past years with these initiatives is that multipolarity, which was to be a fringe neo-fascist theory, mostly defended by Dugin and his acolytes, now it has become a crucial discursive tool of the Kremlin, which is happily sponsoring all these initiatives and counting on the presence of high representatives of the Kremlin, notably Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia. So multipolarity is not exactly a political vision of international relations as it is presented these days in these Kremlin-sponsored events. Multipolarity itself is defined by its opposition to unipolarity, which is assimilated compared to Western hegemony, modernity, and universalism. What Dugin proposes through the multipolarity theory, in principle, is a more egalitarian in international society, a sort of religious and cultural traditionalism against modernity, mostly associated to cultural liberalism, and the very notion of which is highly postmodern in a sense, of a Russian's own truth. Putin breaks with the paradigm of universalism and modernity, arguing that there are different truths regarding different civilizations or different poles in international society. And what I'm trying to what I identified is in a way a very pragmatic evolution coming from the Dugin that used to lead the National Bolshevik Party back in the 90s, with Edward Limonov, who's sitting next to him, where he actually advocated for a return to a dictatorial regime, a state-led economy, and a radical and putting into question radically democracy. Um, it reminds me what have been discussed what has been discussed yesterday. Sorry, regarding how illiberals today do not reject democracy but try to um, void it from hollow it. Sorry, from within. So, in this forum, apart from the classic anti-Western, anti-liberal tropes, um, the there is a there is an effort and a special effort to weaponize anti-colonial discourses. Some of the quotes from the attendance of the to the meeting: Abhinav Pandya, who's a Modi supporter from India, said, when we say multipolarity, we reject imperialism, colonialism, universalism, totalitarianism, religious extremism, and the predatory state behavior in the name of human rights, democracy, and imposing on universal norms, across the globe. Mitsuhiro Kimura, who is a Japanese far-right leader of an irredentist movement called Isukai, said that American and British colonialism and imperialism support a neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine. And Russian propagandist from Brazil, Pepe Escobar, also argued that the Western military juntas, the Western African, military juntas that seized power in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali this past year represent an axis of resistance against French neocolonialism. And that's how we come to the concept of illiberal postcolonialism. Following Marlene's analysis of illiberalism as an ideology and not exclusively as a sort of authoritarianism or regime institutional arrangement, illiberals co-opt the language of freedom and rights, and they end up doing the same thing with anti-colonial rhetoric, which is subject to the same cynical manipulation. The main narrative they're going to articulate is that the multipolar world is suffering from the colonialism of the unipolar world, which allows them and help them to hide all the internal colonialist situations that happen within the poles of the multipolar world they defend, and obviously create a diversion strategy to not to talk about imperialist aggressions they're committing in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Africa, and so on, which I find highly interesting to study this reactionary or illiberal postcolonialism through the lenses of illiberalism as an ideology, is that it is a product of what Marlene identified as an illiberal feedback loop. They denounce in several occasions with a certain legitimacy all the challenges and the contradictions that create colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism, but end up recreating the very same challenges that they pretend to fight, which is anti-egalitarianism, imperialism, racism, right-wing sovereigntism, and so on. So the critique goes and ends up going even further when criticizing not only the geopolitical configurations of um, Western colonialism or neocolonialism, because they end up rejecting and neglecting all the progressive and emancipatory ideas that they associate to the West, which is modernity, democracy, and universalism. With this postmodern, with this postmodern logic that argues that every pole or every civilization has its own truth, they criticize what they associate to the West, the ideas they associate to the West, which is once again universalism, democracy, and modernity, to something essentially perverted. They do not want to do a progressive critique of the double standards that Western society has within its own ideological configuration, but they reject them as essentially perverted. This epistemological rejection of the West and modernity is not only found in within multipolarity or these kinds of forums. There are philosophical equivalences with some of the theorists of the modernity, coloniality, and decoloniality school of thought. This Latin American theoretical school of thought, represented by philosophers like Aníbal Quijano, Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossvogel, that argue that through decolonialization and through decolonizing power and knowledge, they there has to be an emancipation of the ideals or the paradigms of the West, which, just like Dugin, associate to colonialism, genocide, and so on. They end up doing a very similar critique, and not only that, they also address this issue, resorting to very similar intellectuals, which is Martin Heidegger's, especially its phenomenological existentialism, the notion of Dasein, and several authors of the conservative revolution, notably Carl Schmitt and its Nomos of the Earth, and Oswald Spengler. And not only that, the colonial authors, the colonial authors end up bridging through these theories the gaps that could eventually divide the poles of this multipolar world. In these images, we see Marxist, the Marxist thinker Atilio Alberto Boron, who's an Argentinian, a strong supporter of the Venezuelan regime in the multipolarity forum. Sorry, and in the right, in the image at the right, we see him sharing the floor with decolonial theorist Ramon Grossvogel, who's the one holding the microphone, with high representatives of the Venezuelan government. And this is why I argue that we should start considering illiberalism not only as an ideology that we usually find in right-wing actors, governments, political parties, and so on, but also in ideological and theoretical expressions allegedly progressive. And that at the end of the day, create the perfect conditions through this victimization and epistemological cuts to support authoritarian regimes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arsenio. So we are now moving from Russia talking to the global south around illiberal topics to Russia talking to more classic Western illiberal far-right groups, with now John discussing reactionary podcasting and Russian narratives.
Okay, hello. So what I'm going to be talking about is a niche network that I've been following. The platform's illiberal, largely far-right ideas and pro-Russian narratives, including Russian actors. I'm not entirely happy with the title, but it's my bet and now I need to lie in it. A bit of background. This project started from a previous project I was looking at, where was this group of largely American individuals who were fed up with living in the West for ideological reasons, wanted to move to Russia. I noticed that some influencers who were talking to the organizers of that project were themselves talking to people who were talking to people who were talking to people, and that's how I stumbled across this network, which involves quite high-profile people. I'm also very much inspired by the work of Rebecca Lewis, who did this terrific paper on the alt-right pipeline that existed and still to some extent exists on YouTube, where audiences watching people like Joe Rogan would come into contact with really radical ideas. And so I'm kind of following in her footsteps a little bit. For methodology, I used the snowball approach, looked at one influencer and everyone that they spoke with, identified who among those people were influencers themselves, and then continued to study those networks. This involved a lot of manual collection. YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, they don't have a very easy way to identify who appeared in a particular episode. So this involved me kind of going manually, sometimes through archived sites, to find who were in contact with these people. The period I'm looking at is from the start of 2020 to the present. This allows me to capture the 2020 election, the midterm election in the US, and then this upcoming election, along with key moments such as the onset and kind of wind down of COVID-19 restrictions and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For results, thus far, I've managed to capture 650 individuals in my network. That represents about 2,000 hours of content. I used Gephi to put together the network, and this is what it looks like thus far. It's a little limited, but again, this is a work in progress. My goal is to scale this up and capture more data points. I want to take you on a tour here. So the first group we have here, the first community, I identify as the libertarians, and these are largely right-wing folks. You have anarcho-capitalists in here, agorists, but it's largely right-wing ideology that we see here. The two main points that I focused on were Jose Galison, not his real name, based out of Florida, and Clint Russell, also based out of Florida. For some examples of the people that they talk to, we have Jacob Chansley, Adam Christian Johnson, who are famous for their involvement in the J6 attack on the Capitol. But then you also have people like Magnus Panvidia, who is very much a central figure in the Boogaloo movement, which is this accelerationist movement that sees a second US Civil War as the solution to the political problems we're facing. And then also Brandon Caserta, who is one of the individuals who was indicted for conspiracy to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. The next community here, sometimes Gephi grouped this node in with the previous group, sometimes separately. Here I chose to display it separately. This I'm calling Libertarians Part 2, still libertarian, kind of right-wing, but more mainstream than the previous group. It's less alt-right pilled. Here we see more mainstream politicians appearing, and then also just kind of they like to talk about culture. The main central node here is Eric Jackman, who with his brother Mike Jackman hosts the Jackman Radio Show. And they had this very successful series called Politics and Pints, where they would invite political candidates for a beer to talk about whatever they wanted, kind of, mostly politics and their campaign. You can see them here sitting with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but they've also interviewed Ron Paul, Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Roger Stone. Next group, I've identified as kind of the more left-wing group. Here, there's a large focus on geopolitics, and this is also where we see the Russia cluster emerge. The three nodes that I've captured here are Mike Krupa, a Canadian Pole based out of Wrocław, Laurie Spencer, a radio journalist, and Craig Pasta Jardula. For some examples of the people they've spoken to, again, I said this is the Russia cluster. So here we see Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, who's pictured there in Grozny speaking in front of Kadyrov. You have Dmitry Polyansky, who is the deputy Russian ambassador to the United Nations. He appeared multiple times in this group. But then you also get people like Maxime Bernier, the leader of the People's Party of Canada, this right-wing populist party that emerged in Canada not too long ago. And then people like Caleb Maupin, who is a American Marxist-Leninist who advocates for communist populism and is responsible. Well, he's the head of the Center for Political Innovation, which is this socialist think tank in the United States that's responsible for the following image. This is taken from the introductory session to a convention that they had in Chicago, where they marched in all of these banners and symbols to the tune of the Internationale and the American anthem. Fun stuff. And then the last group that I'm going to represent here, I'm describing for now as other. My hope is to find a better descriptor for this, but really this is what I found. And these are just people that kind of talk about whatever they want to. The person I captured here is Welsh Republic, host of the Welsh Republic podcast. He's based out of New Zealand. And here, more than anything, I found people whose only descriptor could really be just Twitter shitposter. Or, you know, he invited a couple of people who were just Twitch streamers, female Twitch streamers who are really into gaming. So he kind of talks about whatever he wants, but has also featured this man, Alexander Dugin. Did a 1 hour long interview with him talking about US foreign policy, about philosophy, about the potential for a civil war in the United States and in Europe. So what do all these people have in common? The first is they're highly critical of mainstream politics and media. They don't like the Republican Party. They don't like the Democratic Party. To the extent that Donald Trump can help them achieve their ends, they might be happy to kind of vote for him or work with him. There's this interesting relationship that's been developing recently where Donald Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy both attended the Libertarian National Convention. To what extent you understand this to be Trump's desperation to get votes, that depends on how charitable you like to treat the libertarian voting bloc in the United States. They also have an affinity for independent research and conspiracy theories. Anti-vax stuff was really big in this entire network. There was one person who was brought on because he created a dating site for anti-vaxxers. And then they also interviewed Andrew Wakefield, who is the origin for the theory that vaccines cause autism, the precursor to modern day anti-vax theories. There are also a lot of people who are just really fundamentally interested in the Kennedy family and the Kennedy assassinations. People like Lisa Pease is a good example of this, who just dedicated their lives to writing book after book after book about the assassinations. 9/11 also features there, the Oakland City bombing, et cetera, you know, take your pick. And then critically, warm opinions on Russian geopolitics and Putin. Here, I'm going to quote Welsh, who asked Dugin, what is it like working with Vladimir Putin, one of the greatest leaders in the world, a man responsible for taking Russia from a third world country to a modern geopolitical force with great potential? Here, I think there are two sources. the first is the libertarian source that holds, taxation is theft, taxation is violence, the principles of non-aggression. But then you also have the left-wing source that's highly critical of US foreign policy, particularly in recent years. I think it's less that Russian actors are kind of brainwashing this entire group. It's more just that there is a kind of symbiotic relationship, that these people already share that ideology and find links. So what about the impact? It's a small group, I'm not gonna lie. If you look on their YouTube platforms, on Rumble, whatever, you're gonna find very few subscribers, very few views. I think part of that is because their stuff constantly gets taken down and they need to kind of disperse it around the internet. But they do have larger profiles on X, formerly known as Twitter. In some cases, 150,000 followers. And then there's also a really strong possibility here for domestic advocacy. Most of the people that I've captured were involved in the organization of the Rage Against the War Machine rally that happened in February 2023 here in Washington, D.C. This is a photo that I took at that rally. And then they came back to DC a few weeks ago for Rescue the Republic, which was a much bigger event featuring RFK Jr. And again, the same people, the same kind of organizers. And it's particularly interesting now, I think, that RFK Jr. has been kind of promised a cabinet position within a potential new Trump administration. So a lot of people that I spoke to kind of saw this as a pathway, voting for Trump and getting RFK Jr. in the White House as a pathway for advancing their ideas. One more point I want to bring here is international parallels. And here I'll point to the profile of Sarah Wagenknecht. My apologies, I don't speak German. But she's a German politician who's exhibited a lot of the same rhetoric that I've observed in my network. So where does that leave me? My goal is to continue to expand the network. There are more nodes that I would like to capture. And I'd like to incorporate a network analysis of their profiles on X. I think that would be very useful. I would also like to systematically analyze the rhetoric, the content of what they're publishing. And here I'd like to thank Dusan Bazalka for giving me the idea of using BERT topic to analyze them. He'll be able to talk more about that in a minute. But that's kind of where I'm at this stage. Like I said, this is still a work in progress. I very much welcome constructive criticism or not so constructive criticism. Let me know how I can improve. If I could give maybe two kind of key points. One is that it's a small group, but they're talking to really high-placed people. And I think it's really interesting, particularly the connections that they've been able to build with Russian officials and with US officials. And then the second thing would be just to stress again that I don't want to suggest that this is kind of like a pipeline of Russian infiltration and influence into the United States. I think is really just kind of an organic cooperation of shared ideology. And with that, I'll leave you. Thank you.
So much, Don, for this great presentation. And yeah, continuing on relatively similar topic, we have Dusan now taking us to unveil conspiracy influencer through the biolab narratives and looking at key amplifier with independent agency in spreading pro-Kremlin disinformation. And very close to the mic.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the organizers again for inviting me to present today. And I'm sorry that we're prolonging this topic. We're going to talk today about QAnon and more specifically conspiracy influencers through the prism of the biolab conspiracy narrative. And you might ask, why is that? Good question. The idea is that when you look at QAnon, it's been a long time now because it first started with Q posting drops on 4chan and then 8chan in 2017, and then Q went silent in 2021. And Q wasn't particularly a fan of Vladimir Putin. He actually criticized him because Q was more centered towards Donald Trump and his administration rather than Vladimir Putin. And when the relationship between Trump and Putin went sour, then Q started criticizing Putin very heavily. And so this brings the question, what happened? Why do we now have a biolab conspiracy narrative that is pretending that Vladimir Putin was right in invading Ukraine to liberate the world population from 46 research laboratories that were actually producing mass biological weapons as part of a World War III subplot? And this was also created by a conspiracy influencer named Clandestine. So where is Q in all of that? So what I wanted to do with this narrative was to sort of understand how we went from Q to conspiracy influencers and how we went from not being pro-Kremlin to having a pro-Kremlin narrative that justified essentially the annexation of parts of Ukraine. And to do that, I want to look at the development of this conspiracy narrative from its production or formation through its projection by conspiracy influencers onto different different platforms, but we'll specifically look at Telegram here, and how it was received by European conspiracy influencers. Because what happened was that at the same time you had conspiracy influencers that were speaking English and producing content in English, you also had European language conspiracy influencer producing content in French, in German, and Italian, and so on. But those are the three languages I focus on. And then to do that, I collect data from different platforms. Here, Telegram through its API, and the API sort of acts as a skeleton for the platform. And if you use a Python code and you give it the right command, then you can extract data from this platform. But I'll come back to this with a concrete example. So when we look at the formation of the biolab narrative, it was created by Clandestine, as I said, this idea of 46 biolab or laboratories in Ukraine producing mass weapons and financed by the Department of State and the Pentagon. And so what this really shows us is a blend of post-COVID-19 conspiracy narratives, because it's this idea that we're within World War III, and the globalists are fighting the righteous, and the globalists are corrupt, and those are the members of the Democratic Party and liberal elites worldwide against the liberators, which is in essence Donald Trump's and his allies, sorry. And this, again, shows the reactualization of Soviet era disinformation campaigns. When you think of the Operation Infection, which was this campaign that was using viruses to promote the idea that the American government was creating the virus of AIDS to target its population. It's also grounded in real events because, as a matter of fact, those laboratories were created to get rid of the anthrax production of the Soviet Union, and they were supported by the US government to achieve that. And another thing that's interesting is that Clandestine, while producing this on Twitter and then on Telegram and his other accounts, had a lot of inspiration taken from Q's drops. And you could tell that he was an avid follower of Q. He was himself formerly an Anon. And he basically took this idea of the corrupt elites to appeal to the audience of Q, because Q went silent and he arrived and produced content to establish himself as a conspiracy influencer. So this is why I'm saying that we're transitioning from Q to conspiracy influencers. When Q went silent, he needed to be replaced by different influencers who were there to produce the right content at the right time. What I'm also seeing from Clandestine is that this dynamic of producing content actually brought upon the radicalization of his content production, because there is just so much you can say about the invasion of Ukraine because it happened. So what next? What he did was that he looked back at other disinformation campaigns, at other articles from RT and Sputnik regarding the war in Ukraine, and before that. So he talked about the Euromaidan crisis, and he produced content about that. And he radicalized himself into using articles from RT and Sputnik. Now, I want to move on to the projection. When you look at the projection, it's no secret that Anons were actually very influential at using what I call the digital affordances. And it's the idea that you can mobilize certain intricate, specific tendencies and the workings of the platforms to achieve your goal, which is to spread Q's narratives or your own narratives. And that happened through, say, hashtag hacking, which hijacking on Twitter. So that's when you produce and you amplify a lot of content so that your content ends up in the trends of Twitter, which is just an example. And when we look at Anons and conspiracy influencers, we also need to keep in mind that we need to look at alternative platforms because they were banned from Twitter, because they were banned from Facebook and YouTube. So we mostly need to look at Telegram and other alternative platforms. And when I look at what I call the counterpublic, so sort of the conspiracy counterpublic that you find today, you have mostly conspiracy influencers and interfacers. Now, I'm not going to dive into interfacers, but just so you know, the interfacers were instrumental in inventorizing what Q was saying. So they created websites and they would basically have the drops that were on 4chan because 4chan is not easily accessible. It's an ugly looking platform and it's hard to navigate. So they were influential in creating those websites to make it easier for people to get accustomed with Q's drops. Now, and they basically emulated Q's identity. Now, the influencers is a different story because the influencers were putting themselves out there. They were showing, they were using their sociological background, their studies, their experience through life to sort of build their audience and make themselves seem reliable by creating different niches according to the different narratives that they were creating. Clandestine is an example of that because he was part of the army before and he was specialized into Q's drops and he built his audience through the invasion of Ukraine because before that no one was really talking about it. He was sort of the first one to talk about it. So he built his niche of a conspiracy influencer through that narrative. And what I'm seeing is that when I look at the networks of channels you find on Telegram, you have about 200 European Telegram channels that focus on spreading conspiracy narratives and pro-Kremlin conspiracy narratives. And the way I'm tracking those influencers is that influencers will rely on multi-platform ecosystems. They will create platforms on Telegram. They will create platforms on True Social, et cetera, et cetera. And I've tracked approximately 140 of them. Which, and one last thing before I show you is that, of course, the projection didn't happen in sort of a vacuum. You had external actors of conspiracy ecosystems that were also projecting that into the mainstream. And one example that I want to mention is the case of Tucker Carlson, because Carlson covered it on Fox News on the 9th of March. And this conspiracy narrative that was created, need I remind you, by a conspiracy influencer was amplified on national television on the 9th of March, following which it was amplified further by the website of the Russian Ministry of Defense on the 24th of March, as the Ministry of Defense uploaded 2 diagrams, one of which was in English, linking directly the creation of those labs with the emails of Hunter Biden and other members of the Democratic Party. So what I'm arguing is that this is one of the first cases we're witnessing where a conspiracy influencer was able to influence the Kremlin directly, not reversed, as is usually the case. So this sort of nuances this idea that conspiracy influencers are merely receiving and amplifying pro-Kremlin narratives. They can also produce it when it works. And so when we look at the projection, here are about, so I've collected a lot of data from Telegram, approximately 80 million messages. And then based off of that, I've sort of narrowed it down to just the messages that were talking about Biolab, the Biolab narrative. So they were containing messages that had the words biolab and its translations in French, Italian, and German. And basically what you're seeing here is a map of the messages that were shared in between accounts on Telegram, which allows me to identify who are the influencers, because the more you're shared, the more your content is shared, the more you're respected in your community, and the more you have a tendency to sort of act as a central point into your community or your cluster. And here you're seeing different clusters. You have the sort of the pink one, that's Italian, the central one, which is English speaking, orange is German, and then on the bottom in green is French. And then another thing I want to say is that, remember when I talked about Tucker Carlson? What you're seeing here is basically the content production regarding the biolab narrative on the second graph. And you see a peak of content production following Tucker Carlson covering it. So what Tucker Carlson did was give it, not just spread it onto the mainstream, but also give it authority amongst conspiracy channels, because it's only when Tucker Carlson covered it that you had a surge in content production regarding the biolab narrative, and not after, when the Kremlin also produced those diagrams. Tucker Carlson was at the center of that dynamic. Now, I want to look at the reception and sort of see how did those European influencers receive and reappropriated that narrative? Because this sorts of beg the question, what is their agency into that? We've seen the agency of clandestine. So what is the agency of those other influencers that received, or that sort of had to amplify to their own communities this narrative? And we can't just look at the reception of the whole group, because that's besides the point. You would miss basically the sociological key elements of who they are as individuals, what they went through, what made them adhere more to this narrative, and what made them adhere less to this other narrative. So this is why I want to focus on one example, which is Le Décodeur. And Le Décodeur is basically the the most influential conspiracy influencer in France. And here what you're seeing is that I've collected everything that they've produced onto their different platforms. And you can see that there are a lot of them. We're not just talking about Telegram. And they're mostly famous because they do 2 to 3 hour long live sessions where they discuss, there are 3, and they discuss basically what happened with the biolab conspiracy narrative. And they present it to their audience, they report about it. And they do so in those lives. And there were approximately 483 lives that I've worked on. And because that's a lot, and there is just so much you can watch, what I did was that I transcribed all of them with a Python code. And then I put them through bird topic. And bird topic, we will basically extract out of those 500 roughly, times 20 pages, Word content, the key narratives that you see emerging. And basically, bird topic will take the words that are mostly used together all the time and will sort of establish a topic. And what I'm seeing is that topic number 8 in red, which is about Russia, only started to pick up following the invasion of Ukraine, which means they weren't talking about it before, which completely challenges the idea that conspiracy influencers, yet again, were merely always pro-Kremlin and were always sharing disinformation that was produced by the Kremlin. That is not the case. It depends on the agency of those individuals, as shown here. Now, why is that, you might ask? Well, let's look at Le Décodeur closely. And what I want to say is that on top of the division of labor that they have and highly professional production, content production, their reception, just maybe 2 things about their reception that is quite interesting, is that they were very susceptible to promoting the biolab conspiracy narrative, because their niche was actually anti-vax conspiracy narratives that were created following the COVID-19 pandemic. And they made sure to have those lives to sort of build an audience, and they would basically react to the worries of their audiences regarding the lockdowns and the vaccines, and they sort of made it their own audience, their niche. Now, it doesn't mean that they're simply adhering to the biolab conspiracy narratives. There are certain sub-narratives that they will not agree with, and they will not agree with the diagrams produced by the Kremlin. And that is because the main host, though he is Francophone and based in Switzerland, is an immigrant from Albania. And one of his co-hosts is from Ukraine, from Dnipro. So, and he speaks Russian fluently. And so both of them will agree to say that we're being manipulated by the mainstream media, but we're also being manipulated by RT and Sputnik. So therefore, we should not look into this. We should not look into their content like Clandestine was doing, but we should look into Telegram and so-called independent journalists that are reporting about the war in Ukraine on the territory of Ukraine. So, but those journalists are ultimately pro-Kremlin themselves. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to nuance this idea of reception of pro-Kremlin and conspiracy narratives because, again, conspiracy influencers were not always pro-Kremlin, and Q wasn't as well. And what we're seeing is that this really depends on who they are as individual, the sociological processes they went through, and who they are as individual. What is their concrete agency that is influenced themselves by the language they speak, where they're from. And then maybe the two last key points I want to mention is that what you're seeing here is that the content production that is both conspiracy related and pro-Kremlin related really depends on what's happening in the world and the demand by the audience to produce content about that. This is really the key point. On top of the amplification by external actors like Tucker Carlson. And maybe just to touch upon the global reception, no one can say, because you'd have to ask everyone what, if they agree with it or what they think of it. But what I can say is that because they're influencers and they have this really intimate link with their audiences, it makes it easier for them to convince their audiences to adhere to not only conspiracy, but also for Kremlin narratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dushan. So really 4 fascinating paper. And so because I want to keep time for the question, I have a lot of questions I could ask, but I will keep them. I just would like to make 2 general comments. The first one is that Russia is really the unique country in the world that can both talk to the Western far right that believe that we need to defend Western civilization, and that can talk to the global South to say we are tired of Western civilization. It's the only country that can do the 2 things at the same time. And it can do it because in both cases, it's liberalism the problem. Right? Western civilization is dying because of liberalism, internal issues. Global South has to fight against Western domination, which is embedded in liberalism. So in both cases, liberalism is the issue, and you can frame it in illiberal terms, both in a Western way to defend Western civilization and in a global South way to go against Western domination. So it's a pretty unique situation, and I think it's pretty well articulated on the Russian side. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are able to put people at the same table coming from both groups. Even in some of the multipolarity conference and other anti-globalization fora, you can have Western far right and global South actors, in fact, a meeting. So just to say that on that, it's really a fascinating case. My other comment is that what this kind of research you are doing now is really, it's really showing how much research on Russian influence in liberalism has been moving forward from the very, I think, toxic and not useful notion of influence that is really scholarly problematic and has been so much kind of instrumentalized to really go much more into nuances and kind of granularity. And what I found maybe fascinating is that capacity of Russian actors to play with fluidity. Right? That it's all, and this notion of liquid world of liquidity, they know how to play that fluidity in all its aspects, ideological, personal, technological, right? So I think what all of your papers are showing is that, as John was saying, it's a symbiotic relationship, right? And as I was saying also myself for long, it's not about influence, it's about confluence of interest. So it's time to rehabilitate what local actors are themselves doing. It's not that they are under influence, it's that they themselves see Russia as a brand, as Russia as producing products that are useful for themselves and for their own things. And you can have the feedback loop effect of Russia itself, kind of absorbing narratives coming from the West. Dushan was showing some of them, but all the anti-vaccine narrative during COVID time, for example, it was not something classic from the Russian far right. It really arrived from American cultural tradition. So I think it's super refreshing to see that research emerging. I may have questions, as I said, but I want to keep the flow going. So I give the floor to the room, and we have mics there. So let's begin. David in the back. Yeah, and then
yeah, so my question is the last, that was a very interesting presentation. I didn't, you had the chart, you know, with the various colors, right? And the one was, the red was Russia, I guess, connected to Ukraine. I was just wondering what some of the other colors, like for example, was immigration. I mean, did you see a jump when, you know, in 2015 or something when the immigration crisis starts and so forth? What were the other topics?
Let me collect three questions first. Yeah, then Perrine is here, and then we come to you.
Hi, I'm Perrine Scher from the Rouen University in France. I had actually the same question for both John and Dusan, if you don't mind. My question was, in terms of impact and circulation of ideas, what are the relationship between, so for John, the alt-right circles, and for Dusan, the conspiracy circles, with far-right media outlets? So my question is how much, so for example, the relationship between conspiracy theorists or the alt-right influences, how much is repeated by, for example, Fox News or like CNews in France? Oh, so what is the relationship? Who is the chicken and who is the egg? Is it the conspiracy theories that inspire Fox News, or do they just repeat what Fox News says? I don't know if my question is clear, but yeah, I'm asking like, who is inspiring who, or is it like a two-way relationship?
And one question here, and then we will do a second.
Thank you. Lucy Hamilton from the University of Technology in Sydney. I was just wondering, Arsenio, is Dugan feeding any of the age of priests, replacing the age of democracy into multipolarity?
Okay, let's go back. Maybe John and Dushan first.
So to answer the first question about the topics, it really depends on the influencer that we're looking at. Now, if you want to know about immigration and immigration crisis topics, they're not the ones because, again, as I was saying, the Albanian host is himself an immigrant, so they will not talk about the great replacement, which also begs the question of their own agency when it comes to adapting certain conspiracy narratives. There is an Italian example that I didn't have time to cite because I work on comparative analysis of three influencers from 3 different countries or linguistic areas. The Italian one is completely into the great replacement and will always talk about it. And that's also partly because of Italy's situation, you know, with the migration crisis. Completely dove into it. But the other topics for Le Décodeur is mostly QAnon conspiracy narratives. So anything that had to do with hacking the DNC emails, Trump not losing the election, Trump actually being president as, you know, maintaining power secretly, stuff like that. And then for the circulation of ideas, it's hard to say who influences who. There are cases that you can pinpoint. It's hard to say, I guess, mathematically and statistically. This is what I'm trying to do, actually. I'm trying to sort of identify the topics of Q's drops and hopefully down the line work on the topics of a big corpus of Fox News or other outlets, articles, and then see the oscillation I don't know if anyone's worked on it, but it's really hard, and it's really, I mean, but there are examples of yes themselves amplifying what's being said in say news or Fox News or whatnot, and on other times you can clearly see that some conspiracy narratives are being projected into the mainstream by some hosts that is on national television. So it's both ways, yes.
I don't think you're going to like my answer because it's going to be very similar to Dusan's. That is difficult to tell. You have both cases. So some of the central nodes in the network, from my observation, would invite these guests on as experts in the field, right? Scott Ritter would be brought on as the Russia expert, who would be then kind of the originator of these narratives. But then some of them also just take the initiative to themselves provide commentary. Clint Russell is he had one episode where he read through Putin's justification for the launch of the special military operation, just read it out to his audience, and then provided some of his own thoughts. You do have plenty of people in the network who themselves are quite prolific on Substack or whatever, and then these people get read within the networks. And then because you have some people within the network, Laurie Spencer worked on the RFK Jr. campaign, who are themselves kind of in close proximity to these high-profile figures. They also kind of work as advisors and advance the ideas. It's really difficult to say who's the influencer and who's being influenced. But yeah, I would say it's a bit of both.
Yeah. I really think that what you just said, Marlene, about Russia talking not to the liberal West, but to the true West, talking about liberalism as something that has been corrupted, but by liberalism itself, that there is a liberal philosophy that can also be a source of influence. That comes. I remember this conversation Dugin had with Tucker Carlson about this topic, and yeah, like Russia knows how to play their cards. They're very pragmatic, and through ideologues, very intelligent, like Dugin, they're able to establish this mutual beneficial relations, indeed. You should read Gabriel Tarde, who's a sociologist who studied the early communication flow of journalism and media in the 19th century, who understands this flow of communication as a two-way relation between the journalist or the publicist, as he would say, and its audience. And regarding the age of priests replacing the age of democracy, I'm very convinced that what Max Weber said a long time ago about the disenchantment of the world is still going on, and it will be certainly. But what we're seeing here with Islam at a micro level in Russian prisons, in decolonial militant circles, what we're seeing with all the mobilizations against gay marriage is an identitarian reaction to the desecularization of societies. Religiousness is becoming not something that that was macro-social or cultural, but even individualistic and rationalized and politicized. There is a French sociologist that studied the Manif pour tous, the movement against opposed to gay marriage in France in 2013, Yann Resson de Clessieux.
who observes this perfectly.
Let's take a second round of questions. There was one here.
Thank you so much. It was a great panel. My name is Antonio Rosales from York University. And I want to ask Arsenio very interesting linkages with the Latin American decolonial, which speaks to Goldnas's original kind of theoretical attempt there. So it's a really nice conversation there. But I wanted to ask you if you've noticed any reaction or response from the core group of the decolonial group, whether Mignolo or Escobar or Lander have actually addressed these connections that Grossvogel and Boron have, although Boron is not part of the group, but whether they have addressed that and whether they have distanced themselves from it or not. And so I would be interested to see whether there are further connections between them and among them with Dugin and others in Russia.
Just in the back, and then Julian.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I'm with Freedom House. So this is I'm asking you guys to take a leap here, because I know as academics you're not necessarily thinking about policy, but as somebody who works in the development space, I think about policy a lot. So one of the things that is increasingly frustrating is the counter narrative seems to be like all of this is influence, all of this is external, everything is fine at home, there are no problems, this is all conspiracy. Is the answer that, like, how would you, I guess, encourage governments to be like, this is more nuanced than that? Or is it worked, I feel like, in 2014 with banning ISIS off of Twitter, and Ask FM. And I remember that. But I don't know if you can ban all of these actors or if that would even help. So thank you.
Hi, fantastic panel. Julian Waller, George Washington University. This is for John. Amazing presentation. The snowball method that you use might not allow for this, but I'd be very interested in the degree to which you can maybe check the degree to which there is network connections or connections to connections to connections, how many degrees of separation to sort of the big podcaster names in the dissident right or right wing. I'm not just thinking about Tucker Carlson is a really big one, but also Steve Bannon's War Room podcast is really huge. Daryl Cooper, the Martyr Made podcast, is also probably the most dissident of the mainstream right wing podcast. But there's also the All In Tech podcast with David Sachs that's very pro-Russian, relatively speaking. I'm just wondering if you can kind of force that into your network and then see if there are any connections that wouldn't work with the snowball method. But I'm just wondering if you're getting that or if they're talking about other podcasts without necessarily having people on as interviewees because they're too small and groovy, crunchy, and weird and RFK supporters. And obviously, at the end of the day, if anyone's going on Joe Rogan, that's the most man on the internet.
John, do you want to begin on that?
Sure. I'll take Julian's question first. The answer is easy, and yeah, I've seen it. Part of looking at manually 650 individuals means looking at the backgrounds and building a profile of them. So I can tell you that degrees of separation to War Room, to Joe Rogan podcast, to Tim Pool and Tim Cast is like 2 or 1. There are people here that are brought on because they appeared on War Room, that because they appeared on Timcast. Actually, a couple of the individuals, part of the Timcast crew, there are maybe 3 or 4 of them in the entire network, and there's one of them. I mean, Tim himself, but there are a couple of individuals that I flagged as being involved in the Tenet kind of network, this Russian influence via RT to podcasters in the US. So yeah, very small degrees of separation. And across the entire network, like I mean, it's a small network that I mapped out, but knows of separation from like one point to the other is 3 generally. So it's very, very small. I will take a brief stab at Sarah's question. How to approach policy? I don't know. If I did, I wouldn't be here. I don't think that that banning them is the solution. I like to, I don't know, me personally, I'm a big advocate of freedom of speech. So I don't think banning them is the solution at all. But in terms of how to fix the problem, I wish I knew.
Can I add before giving you the floor? I agree. I think strategies of banning are not a solution because you're just postponing and to new technological spaces and then to enforcing the kind of underground or rebellious aspect. Then you really have issue of institutional culture among federal institutions. So we will do like if we were on Chatham House rule for that part of the discussion. So that was the end of the Chatham House moment. And now we're back to Arsenio.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for your question. Like the coloniality theorists have been criticized for long now from materialist perspectives, but not only. And how they've been addressing theoretically these critiques. They're dehistoricizing colonization. They are they have a simplistic vision of what modernity is. They address them in their like academically, and the last publication of Walter Mignolo, which is where he fully quotes Spengler, Schmitz, has been very like not only in academic circles but also in more militant and political circles criticized. I don't think that he has an answer yet because the book is quite recent. But what I'm missing here is the critiques or the confrontation coming from militant circles of the last I mean the latest declarations, public declarations of Ramon Grosvogel when he's invited by the Venezuelan government to talk about the Ukrainian invasion, where he says literally like some things like the multipolar world is being attacked in Ukraine by the West, and this what I find outrageous coming from a decoloniality theorist. It has not been, or at least I did not see any confrontation coming from political or academic circles, and it won't be me who does it.
I'm not gonna add a lot, considering Marlene said pretty much everything that I was thinking. But what I will say is that banning, it's been said before, it doesn't help, but QAnon really shows that because they've been banned from Twitter. Now they're back on X. They've been allegedly banned from Facebook and YouTube, which is what made them go to Telegram for European conspiracy producers, and then when you look at English conspiracy producers or in English content, they're more on True Social. And you know, I've been working also on True Social, and it shows that the first narrative that's being shared on True Social is election fraud. And what I will say also is that it doesn't mean that it's not because they were banned that they're not active on those mainstream platforms anymore. The example I mentioned, Le Décodeur, they have They archive everything they have on Rumble and Odyssey, but they have a network of about 200 sleeping accounts on YouTube that they use to still upload their content up until the moment it's banned, and then they just go on to another sleeping account, and they keep on working on YouTube. So it just doesn't have banning, and mainstream platforms congratulate themselves in banning, but they didn't.
Yeah, maybe also just note also connecting maybe to the comment that Marlene you made at the beginning. I think there are like two rules of thumb that I'm continuously, I think, adopting. The one is like Russia or Russia link actors do not create trends. They may amplify them, but usually the trends are already there. And two, you really have to give the agency to people. So in terms of like, they're not stupid, whether in Africa or here in the US, like they know what Russia is, they know who these people are. It's like, you know, they're perfectly aware, but still they choose. And I think indeed understanding why, knowing everything, they still choose for it. I think that's maybe the key.
Maybe, and we will conclude that to kind of connect what I was saying at the beginning on Russia talking to both Western far right and Global South and this question of actors. I think what you will see in your ongoing research is Africa as the platform where the Russian religious actors are learning from the US evangelicals on how you do business. Right, so you have this kind of triangulation between, so, you know, the US was very good at creating these trends before Russia met them. And then you have kind of circulation between what is West, what is Global South, what is Russia, and you have local agency to be kind of rehabilitated. On that, please join me in thanking our four great presenters.